Russia's strategy could be more advantageous than we had hoped. Contrary to the hopes of optimists, Russia's enormous human and financial loss in the Ukrainian war is unlikely to continue the war, which is unattractive for the country. Russia has a lot to gain going forward. While the war is costly, Russia will have to pay those costs longer than Ukraine. Russia could lose more than 50,000 people in Ukraine in addition to the immeasurable economic damage caused by sanctions, direct costs and jobs abandoned in the war. Many in the West hoped that Russia's attack, which failed to capture all of Ukraine at the beginning of the war, would be a costly mistake and that Russia would eventually be forced to withdraw. They are wrong. Russia can and will continue to fight. The highly anticipated spring protests in Ukraine, although not yet clarified, have begun to subside. If the same outcome happens in the coming weeks, the war could end in a stalemate. Why is Russia going on a war that seems almost ready forever, where no one can win the other? For this, we need to examine the general perspective of Russia. How to get to Russia? To understand the purpose of how long Russian President Vladimir Putin will stay in Ukraine, we must start from 2014. After that, a conflict broke out between the opposition and the government. The army overthrew the president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych. These events came to be known as the Merdeka Revolution. If we can understand why Russia sees Merdeka as a threat, we can understand Russia's intentions behind its relationship with Ukraine. From the point of view of Russia, the first problem with Merdeka Square is the move towards the end of NATO membership. While the opposition's main goal is to integrate Ukraine into the EU, not NATO, Russia sees this as a slippery slope. Moscow, whether imperial, Soviet, or federal, has always considered the threat from the territory of modern Ukraine, especially from the east of the Dnieper, completely impossible. It will do whatever it takes to eliminate the rebel forces in the region. The idea of NATO troops east of the Dnieper, especially in the Crimea, is surprising in Moscow. This is why Moscow sees NATO's eastward expansion as the biggest threat. Secondly, Russia has an interest in Crimea because there is no suitable place to build a military port on Russia's Black Sea coast all year round. Therefore, the Russian Black Sea Fleet has to rely on the Crimean port of Sevastopol for operations. Maintaining the right to use the Crimean Navy is a condition for Russia to maintain its rights over the Black Sea. Practically, Crimea is the only part of Ukrainian territory that is useful to Moscow and not at a bad price, so to avoid threats. However, the experience of Russia after its annexation of Crimea in 2014, particularly Ukraine's economic encirclement of the peninsula and the cutting off of its water supplies, shows that control of mainland Ukraine immediately adjacent to Crimea is essential to the promotion of Crimea. Finally, Russia is trying to avoid the loss of credibility that would result if the Russian rebels in the Donetsk and Luhansk provinces were completely defeated. This is not only a matter of Russia's arrogance, but also the main goal of maintaining its power in the post-Soviet space. Russia takes responsibility for protecting ethnic Russians in Georgia and other ethnic Russian groups such as Ossetians and Abkhazians. Being seen as weak and ineffective in this role will affect the continued influence of Russia over its neighbors. Russia still has a lot to gain from the war in. Despite Russia's great equipment and reputation in the Ukraine war, we aim to give Russia a good reason to stubbornly stick to its current position. Clinging to the land bridge between Crimea and Donbass might refer to Crimea as a bad idea in the post-2014 period, when Russian territory spread over most of Donetsk and almost all of Luhansk to show heartfelt support for the rebels. Unless the situation changes, Russia's two main assets in the region, the port of Sevastopol and the reputation of its patron, will remain intact. If the battle lines remain stable, the main point for Russia will be the crucial area east of the Dnieper, still in Ukrainian hands. As international relations scholar John Mearsheimer points out, Russia's second best option for good regional governance is to make Ukraine a task force, and Russia has done that very well. Compared to Russia, Ukraine is older, poorer and demographically unstable, low birth rates, negative net migration and smaller. These problems were caused by war, with young men killed in war and young women and children becoming refugees. More importantly, Ukraine's infrastructure was destroyed. A country facing a demographic crisis like Ukraine needs to rapidly develop its economy and increase its capacity to cope with an aging and declining population. On the contrary, this war has damaged Ukraine economically, and the number of returning refugees has decreased. Russia only respected the protection of its allies to maintain the existing protection, doing so in order to maintain its long presence in Crimea, and to shed more Ukraine's blood is likely to make Ukraine a bad country. It is not capable of being a good base for NATO assets in the long run. At the same time, the impact of the sanctions on the Russian economy fell short of expectations, and Russia's large population, including millions of Ukrainian refugees, means that the civil war affecting Russia is very rare. Putin knows very well that Russia can sustain a losing war longer than Ukraine. If Russia can stand on the ground, even an expensive victory is still a victory. Finally, the West can find its solution through Russia. On its current path, Russia will eventually want to increase its profits. If the current offensive fails and a long-term conflict ensues, the West should reconsider its willingness to start war, which continues to destroy Ukraine's ability only to help Russia solidify its strategic objectives.